what are a couple things that people can do this week that actually matter? That, I mean, obviously you're unable to diagnose them or whatever, but what are just a couple things that people can do that actually will move the needle for, say, most people?
Well, if I can, I'll just reinforce again, the bad S's, minimize your intake of sweet starches, snacks, and sitting, meaning getting up and move more. How much exercise should I do? More resistance training. Cardio is good, but resistance training has been overlooked. I think that's starting to become recognized, that lifting things, moving things, resistance bands, those kinds of things. So sweet starches, snacks, seed oils, sitting, don't smoke, of course.
This is the Longevity Loop podcast, and I'm your host, Brent Wallace. In every episode, I bring you the leading voices in longevity, plus my own insights to put the world's best strategies directly into your hands, making elite longevity strategies accessible to everyone, regardless of your background. So let's jump into the loop, starting right now. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Longevity Loop podcast. We've got another great episode scheduled for you today. The Longevity Loop is brought to you by Spanner.com, SPANNR.com, and that's our longevity directory that we put all our doctors in. If you're looking for a specialty doctor in your area, or if you're looking just for information in general about longevity, we've got a huge archive of articles, podcasts, newsletters. So go over there, check it out. Really cool stuff. And just a quick heads up, this isn't medical advice. Even though Dr. Bax is a doctor, you want to consult with your doctor before taking any of the things that we're going to be talking about, or consult with Dr. Bax himself. But for the most part, this is just a conversation to help you think a little bit differently about your health, and in particular with this episode, your heart health, as Dr. Bax will get into. So as I said, today's guest is Dr. Craig Bax. And the funny thing is, how I met Dr. Bax is through my dentist, which isn't usually the way that I meet the medical professionals that I interview on this show. Is a really cool experience through my dentist. Very, very unique protocol that Dr. Bax will be getting into. And once, we've talked before, and once I really started digging into what he's building, I was like, wow, this is a lot different than kind of the standard heart health protocol that you might hear a lot of times. Dr. Bax has gone through his own medical, personal health journey, which she'll get into, and which always matters to me, that he's really focused on helping people actually get to the root of what's going on and not just manage the symptoms, which, as most of us listening know, that's kind of the standard medical care of the medical system in general is kind of like that. It's managing symptoms, not really getting to the root causes of things. And one thing I love to talk about on this show is really getting to the root causes of things and optimizing your health from a ground up perspective, instead of just the Band-Aid approach that it seems that most of the medical industry is kind of operating on these days. Dr. Bax is behind the Cure Center and the Cure Coach, which I'm sure we'll get into. And really what stood out to me is the mix of personal experience that Dr. Bax has, and also just trying to really solve the problems that most people feel stuck with. And it's just kind of, okay, this is just part of my life, and just, and then they just continue on that path that's unoptimal. So with all of that said, Dr. Bax, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah. Love to have you here. I mean, I just love doing these type of shows because, I get educated one, and it's just really cool for, people like you getting more and more out there and just telling the story to a lot more people. So you've got a personal health journey. I've watched that YouTube video of yours that led you to this place. So let's start there. What was going on with you with what you were discovering, and your kind of aha moments and discovery moments through this process?
Well, first of all, comments about mainstream healthcare. I've been as mainstream as they come. I've been practicing medicine for over 40 years. I finished medical school in 1981, finished my residency in 84. And, I call myself a recovering allopath, or an open-minded allopath, so for those who know the nomenclature, allopathic medicine is traditional Western medicine. You have an ill, I have a pill, um, surgical procedures, it's reactive medicine. And, I was caught up in that. I practiced for about 25 years, primary care, internal medicine. I love the detective work. People would come in with symptoms anywhere from I just don't feel well to people coming in cardiac arrest and, you know, practicing that gamut. More or less, at first, a balance of hospital and outpatient, but then more outpatient. I went through a bit of a change in careers. I decided I wanted to take a little bit of a break and transition. I'd spent 3 years as a hospital chief medical officer. So instead of doctoring people directly, I was trying to help to kind of manage the medical staff, function and behavior. And then I'd left there after 3 years because, I found I missed patient care. And there was some aspects about hospital administration I liked, but it just I wasn't everything that I thought it was going to be. So I went back into medical practice. At that time, had ballooned up to about 235 pounds. Stress, relying on the traditional recommendations. It's all trying to eat a low-fat diet, but don't worry about sugar. And I was confronted by a former neighbor of mine who he was a fitness fanatic. At that time, was very much into CrossFit. He was about 10 years older than I am. And his name is Mike. I won't mention last names to protect the guilty for right now, but nevertheless, and there's a whole, you can find that. Actually, there's about an hour and a half interview. We actually went out to the CrossFit headquarters and got interviewed by one of their leadership there, got to meet Greg Glassman, have lunch with him and all. So
Wow.
he said, he saw a picture of me and I was even fatter than I am now. And he kind of insulted me left and right. And he says, why is it? And he says, I won't drop any of the horse language, but why in the don't you doctors take better care of yourselves? And so he used me as a subject, kind of a patient zero, and he thought if he could influence me and get me in better shape, that would inspire other healthcare professionals to follow suit. And I bought into that, and it helped. So I lost about 65 pounds, got down to under 170, in the best shape of my life. I was doing some pull-ups and, kind of stuff I never imagined. Um, but then COVID hit and, it kind of fell out of that. I also had some injuries, shoulder. And so long story short, 2 hip operations, lower back surgery, neck surgery. I'm not doing that high intensity work at this point in time. And I have regained some of my weight. Exercise has been limited. So if you see me now, you say, well, he looks like he's heavier than 170. And you're right. But, I'm human. I have one of the things that I count on for the longevity of my practice is that, human behavior is what it is. We do better, we do worse, we get committed and then we relapse to bed. So anyway, been there, done that. But in the process, I learned I had a carotid ultrasound of my own at a lipid meeting. And it verified that I had arterial disease. I have atherosclerosis. And I'm like, now what should I do? And I was taking, I think at that time I was taking a statin for high cholesterol, but that was about it. And I went and long story short, I found out about the Bale Doneen method. It was a 2-day course, a preceptorship, 17 hours of drinking from a fire hose. Learned that pretty much everything that I've been taught about cardiovascular disease was wrong. Mark Twain says, it's not what we don't know that gets us into trouble. It's all the things we know for sure that just ain't so. And so I learned at that point that arterial disease is an inflammatory progressing condition in the artery wall, not in the lumen, and that this progression can be stopped and it can be put into remission. And the people that taught it to me offered a money back guarantee that if you had a heart attack or a stroke, they refunded their fee for the past year. And they had only written one check in the last 15 years. So anyway, long story short, I emulated that. That's pretty cool. I wanted to have my own evaluation, but their cost was so high and it was so cumbersome. I had to fly. I would have to fly to their location in either Tennessee or Washington State, plop down at that time about $10,000, and go through the process. And like any cheap Midwestern German blue collar kid, I said, I wonder if I could do it myself cheaper. And so I went about the process of fixing solving my own problem. This is how most inventions and businesses start, or many do. It's like, I'm going to deal with my problem, and maybe my problem is something that other people have. Well, lo and behold, I mean, arterial disease is, I'm just going to say, unless proven otherwise, you've got it if you're an adult over the age of 30. And it actually starts in our teens if you really use very sensitive tests. And so I thought, wow, wouldn't it be awesome to have, to be kind of an innovator in a market that's, doing very poorly, but has a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of work that could be done. So that's kind of where I am today. For the last 12 years, I've been focusing on arterial disease and mostly focusing on taking the work or the lessons that I learned from Dr. Bale and Dr. Doneen back in 2013 and figuring out how to do it in a way that's more accessible for more people. And that includes getting the cost down, uh, enabling them to utilize their third-party payment if possible, and also deliver it look more often than not in the same way that you and I are connecting over distance now by telemedicine services. So I transitioned the name of my practice from my personal name to, well, first I called it the Center for Prevention of Heart Attack and Stroke, and then I came up with an acronym. And CURE stands, it's not a promise, although it's an aspiration. It stands for the Catastrophic, Unseen, Reversible Epidemic of Cardiometabolic Disease. So CURE, Catastrophic, Unseen, Reversible Epidemic, which I wanted to describe attributes of this condition and also kind of say something about what the practice is all about. Cure Coach is a company that I started because I needed a software platform to pull everything together, to communicate with patients, to share information, to educate, and to organize. And that's what the Cure Coach company was about. And we developed it's called curecoach.app, curecoach.app. It's a mobile friendly website, and it enables me to interact more efficiently, share documents in a HIPAA compliant way during telemedicine meetings. So I tried to anticipate where everything was going, and be as digital, paperless, and I'm there. I don't have to use any paper at all. It's all digital, and pulling together all the resources to deliver the same kind of care. And I'm happy to say in the last 12 years, not one of our patients has suffered a heart attack or a stroke. So I should be charging a whole lot more and offering the money back guarantee. I'm not
Yeah,
that
that's
great.
an amazing statistic. I remember you sharing with that one of the first times that we talked, and I was like, that's an impressive stat.
Well, I'm not, at first I didn't tout it very much the first 5 or 6 years because number one, I wasn't really sure, but after a while I just noticed, and then I realized I tend, I was brought up not to be, as I was always told as a kid, don't get too big for your britches. That was, don't brag, just do the work. But that at some point I came to the conclusion that, well, if I'm getting these kind of results, people need to know about it. So it's not brag. It's just a reality. It's just a fact. And it, but it's also kind of a scary thing for a healthcare system that's addicted to the revenue from the number one cause of death and disability. And the way it's dealt with is late stage rescue with stents and surgery and rehab and all those kinds of things, which generate tremendous revenue volume for the healthcare system and third party payers as well. So we could get into that if you like, but we'll go. So I kind of laid out, um, the journey from being a reactive, traditional physician to now being, I call it proactive medicine as opposed to preventive medicine, because in reality, most of us are past the point of prevention when it comes to cardiometabolic disease. So that's, arterial disease, heart attack, stroke, dementia, kidney failure, and, the type 2 diabetes and pre-diabetes, and what I call pre-diabetes, or the rest of the world calls it insulin resistance. So these things are far more reversible, far more preventable. But the key thing is to know that you have a problem. You're more likely to react to get rid of the problem as opposed to, preventing something. Well, that we'll get to that tomorrow. So that's part of how I try to separate myself from the rest of the herd.
Yeah, that sounds like a whole different framing of it instead of just going into a checkup and then the doctor's like, okay, you're great to go. Where like from what you found, it sounds like it's like, hey, everyone has some extent of this buildup that's dangerous and it only gets worse. And you're saying you're coming less from a point of preventative because it's already happening in most everyone until they prove otherwise, like you said.
Right.
So
Yeah.
really, your whole approach is reversing the damage that's there. So with you and other doctors, what were the doctors missing or couldn't connect that you later figured out? Like, obviously you go into a cardiologist and, they're like, okay, here's a EKG or, whatever stress tests or whatever. And
Mhm.
they say, hey, your heart's fine, send you on your way. So they're obviously missing something there and not connecting the dots. So what was it that you figured out that, you were previously missing and that these doctors are not really connecting the dots here?
It's a really great question. First of all, I will say they're overlooking or not looking for the same things that I was overlooking and not looking for, because that was the way I was trained. The only thing I would say that maybe is different about me than maybe vast majority of other physicians is I'm rebellious and open-minded and willing to change my mind. And being in solo practice, I'm able to innovate and change my mind and, make a change more easily than if I was in a, you know, larger practice where you had to get permission for everything from a committee and you have to analyze it to death. The analysis, paralysis by analysis,
Yeah.
is the term. So, what you call a vote of 99 to 1 among physicians? A tie.
Bring on the doctor jokes. Let's go.
Right. So, and this is a big part of why I didn't. I mean, I play well with others. I've been president of my state medical society. I've been chairman of the board of the Illinois State Medical Society. I've been a member of the AMA House of Delegates. So I know what it is to work with a team. But if you want to get something done quickly, you go by yourself. What I'm interested now in is in going far, you go with others. So it's important to start building a network of, team. So, but one of the things in particular was this dental connection. I heard a lecture, the first time I ever heard a lecture from a dentist or a periodontist ever in my life, because in pre-med, dental medicine, dental school was where I'm sorry to say to my dental, I don't know how many dentists listen to this, but, the old, what's that, the Hangover movie? Oh, you're not a doctor, you're just a dentist.
Yeah.
And I promise I don't, I respect dentists and what they do. I mean, some of the stuff they do is amazing, but the idea that about 50% of heart attacks and strokes, you can tie back to inflammatory conditions in the mouth. And I went, what? You know, but in reality, when you dig into the science of what's driving the inflammation, bacteria and inflammation in the mouth and infected root canals, gum disease. In fact, I say, I've come up with the smoking gun for your heart attack might be your smoking gums. The inflammation that's in the gums maybe have driven that event. So that was one thing. And then the focus on, okay, what really is happening as this disease progresses and what really happens when an event takes place. And so I use the analogy of acne all the time. So if you think of the wall of your artery as your skin, acne is an inflammatory condition, more generalized, but in spots you get pimples, and that's what an atherosclerotic plaque is. And if that plaque is big enough, yes, it can constrict the blood flow in the lumen, but why does it suddenly, you're fine 1 minute, then next minute you're in an ambulance, fighting for your life. And if you're lucky, you get to the hospital and get rescued, with a stent or angioplasty. And the answer is, well, that plaque, like a pimple, can rupture or pop. So, and it's when it's the newly formed plaque is the most vulnerable to rupture. That rupture of the plaque causes the blood clot to form within the lumen of the artery. And it's the blood clot that cuts off the blood supply to part of your heart or part of your brain, heart attack, stroke. And so you have this thing that goes very slowly for a while, and then suddenly it erupts like a volcano, if you want to use another metaphor. So that was really an aha, moment. And by the way, you can detect this easily with safe detection techniques like carotid ultrasound, and you can actually measure and see it reverse. You see your artery wall get thinner and healthier. So it was really, and it really appealed to my, uh, at the time, with fitness, one of the things that I learned in that process was that if you expect to get better, you have to measure it. So you have to track your times, and you need to uh, keep track of your personal records or personal bests for your bench press or the number of squats you can do or how, how heavy you can squat or all those kinds of things. But if you don't measure it, you're not going to improve. So that's one of the key that and in mainstream medicine we do this with blood pressure and cholesterol levels, but it matters what you measure. And so turns out we're measuring many of the wrong things. So like the focus on LDL cholesterol, I tell my patients now, we'll look at it, but we're not going to stare at it the way your other doctors are doing. We're going to actually look at other things like measures of inflammation, like artery wall thickness, like LPPLA2, myeloperoxidase, microalbumin to creatinine ratio. I'm not, these are just things that aren't done as part of mainstream healthcare, and digging more deeply into the root causes that aren't looked at and doing our best to mitigate each one of them to the greatest extent we can. Um, One of the issues that we focus on a lot is we're not just shooting for good, we're shooting for optimal. So, for instance, with vitamin D, the mainstream healthcare would define a vitamin D deficiency as under 30, but an optimal vitamin D is probably closer to 100. So in my mind, a vitamin D level of 60 is still vitamin D deficiency to some extent because it's not optimal. Why is that important? Well, vitamin D is the so-called sunshine vitamin, which is more like a hormone, is central to a lot of immune functions, insulin sensitivity. There, it's just one example of if you have the wrong target, yeah, you're going to be average, but who wants to be average? Who was happy, getting a C? At least among people who really want to excel. So we're shooting for an A plus in all these measures, and that's how you put that all together. And each person is an individual. For you, genetically, there may be some factors that don't affect me and vice versa. So you can't just say one size, there's not one size fits everybody. In fact, I always say one size fits nobody.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems like the medical establishment as a whole is kind of like, when you look at the CDC recommendations, like you just said, like the vitamin D, it's grossly under, and even like you said, the 60 is it milliliters per deciliter or whatever
Milligrams
the
per
measurement
deciliter.
is. A lot of even functional health, kind of even more kind of, quote unquote cutting edge physicians will say that 60 is that prime number to that's the minimal. Whereas like, yeah, with more progressive providers like yourself and, they're saying, 80, 90, 100 is more optimal. So, yeah, that makes sense. The traditional cookie cutter approach works for no one.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna be cynical and sow some skepticism. Why is it that the system doesn't adapt to these new things? Well, I'll go back to that 99-to-1 vote. In healthcare, innovators have generally not been welcome, and that's true in science and in all kinds of institutions, the church, education, academia. People with new ideas Galileo, didn't do, he wasn't praised during his lifetime. you know, they so these new, and I'm not, I don't mean to imply that I'm Galileo or that. All I've done is I've recognized that the results we're getting are terrible. And well, so if you reverse engineer a process that's getting terrible results, then you're going to find a lot of flaws in that process. And my plea, if I can make one thing, is our approach should be who's getting the best, in many, when I was in particularly at the hospital as a chief medical officer, I was introduced to the idea, best practices. What institutions are doing the best? Let's emulate them. And yet that really doesn't, what really happens is who's doing the best? Let's throw stones at them and bring them down to our level. And that's how we're going to compete. That's how we're not going to lose patients to them. You know what I'm saying? And it's kind of part of human nature, that we don't say, oh, that's really cool. I'm going to do that like that and see if I can, or maybe even do it better. When in fact, what tends to happen is like, okay, what can I do to, make myself better looking by comparison by, you know, tar- tarnishing their reputation or pointing out the flaws in their thinking.
Yeah, my British friends call it the tall poppy syndrome.
Exactly.
like it's like there, and then yeah, you'll get cut down. But I
But
also feel like a big part of that is also just, I mean, kind of almost what you're alluding to, but like everyone's safe in this zone where it's like financial incentives, kind of tend to lean towards a more conservative approach. And I think there's also the thing about liability, right? Like if you're just going through the standard care, you don't have a level of liability that someone maybe doing some different things might, because there is something that happens along was like, well, that's how everyone else does it. And then you're like, okay, well, then you're not culpable at that point. Whereas if you are doing something that's cutting edge and novel, and something happens, probably whether it's your fault or not, they're going to be like, well, he wasn't doing things normally. So, or she, like aren't doing things the normal way. And so maybe that's what we should look at. And I think that's a lot of the times what holds the medical industry back as well.
well, that's our story and we're sticking to it, but it becomes, that's like the rebar is put into place, but what really cements it into place is that they figured out how to monetize it and be financially more successful as a result. So, and I've been, as I said, we've been doing this for 40 years, and there's a quote that I put on my website, among others, by a guy named Eric Hoffer, who I think is otherwise relatively unknown. He's written a book. I have not read the book, but I love the quote. It says, "Every good thing starts out as a movement, becomes a business, and ultimately degenerates into a racket." And I think I've seen at least the last two stages over my 40 years as managed care, started to take root. We need to control costs, which is a good idea, good intentions. But ultimately, no matter how you do it, the incentives somehow, just show me the incentives and I'll figure out how to make money. And right now, I think the money changes have taken over the temple and have overwhelmed the ethics of finance, have overtaken the ethics of Hippocrates. So and I mean, it's just gotten more and more. And so if defensive medicine, I mean, started in response to too many lawsuits. As president of State Medical Society, I was elected during a year when we got liability reform, when our enemy was the plaintiff's bar. Those terrible lawyers who sue doctors. But I've also learned that the number one reason that patients sue doctors is not because they're injured. It's because after the injury, they're stonewalled. They never get, there's no admission that something went wrong. Well, why is that? Who tells us to not talk to them? The attorneys. Who benefits from lawsuits? Well, ultimately, the plaintiff might get some money, but the attorneys ultimately are the ones that, the system is perfectly designed to get the results that it's getting. And that's who truly benefits from it. So until we take a real hard, long look at the incentives, So defensive medicine, is very lucrative for hospitals and radiologists. You know, order another test, but is it good for patients? Uh, they're getting exposed to radiation, IV contrast, all these kinds of things. Probably not. I tell patients all the time now, and I'm going to say right here now, it's just like with free software. If you're not paying for it, you're not the customer. You're the product.
Yeah, I've heard that before. Uh, but yeah, I mean that's a great way to put it, and I don't think, especially with our listeners here, I feel like our listeners are a little bit more educated than the average bear, but really knowing that the system is broke and actively seeking different solutions, and I think that's almost what the longevity kind of community and movement has come to realize, and with great clinicians and doctors such as yourself really like, hey, something's wrong here. There is a different way to do this, and this is how you can move the needle instead of just being based in this like sick care system that I don't think anyone really thinks it's working that great, except, as you said, is like the people making money, they think it's working great. But for us patients, it's just not. It's just really not. And it's really, it's like I'm lucky to be working in this industry. And so I really get to talk with a lot of great people and do a lot of research and be like, wow, get turned on to some really great ideas. But that's not most people. Most people don't really have the time to dig deep into like what's really affecting their health, or even like what you deal with. It's a hidden thing that people don't know, which is almost more insidious in so many cases, because the tests and ability to get tested without an actually overt system or symptom rather, like you're just, for lack of a better term, you're screwed, and until you actually show symptoms. And so many times when you show the symptoms, it's too late. And so, it's just like one of those things. So with you, what was one of the first things that you found that actually moved the needle, like, with yourself, but also with the people you're working with, right? I mean, there was obviously some light bulb moments that were going off with you where you're like, hold on, let's try this. And it sounded like it started with the two, clinicians or doctors that you went to and, a while back, but
Well, I would say it really started with the, like, oh, heck, I've got this disease. Here it is on ultrasound. I can see it, seeing is believing. So you can't deny it anymore. I mean, I knew my dad had 3 stents, almost died of a heart attack. My mom had multiple strokes and diabetes, but that's sort of abstract. But now suddenly you see it. It's kind of like that, moment when a mother, an expectant mother has her first ultrasound, and then you see the picture of the baby. And so, that's like, this is real. This is not, theoretical anymore. So I think there's that. To be quite honest with you, most of the things that I do that help people, I learned not from medical journals or from doctors, but from fitness coaches. They're kind of ahead of their time, and they're so when I first walked into the gym, and my coach Mike said, "Well, you think this is you're going to have a 6 pack?" And I said, like, I'd be happy to see my toes, you know. And he said, but the 6 pack isn't going to be built in the gym. It's going to be built in the kitchen. It's not it's not working out. It's what you eat. And the answer is don't eat any sugar. Guess what? There's sugar in everything. The same diabolical executives and chemists that made tobacco addictive are now working for food companies and making food addictive, and so-called food, processed food. Um, Frankenfood, I call it, I spell it PHOOD, it's, and then we're being
right.
PHOOL'd by these PHOOD companies. So, first of all, transitioning the lifestyle emphasis away from, too much fat and red meat and all that kind of stuff to, hey, we're just eating way too much sugar. Now, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's if you want to go on one thing. And so my advice is, from lifestyle is to avoid the bad S's, sweets, starches, snacks, sitting, seed oils, smoking, salt, sleep disturbance, stress, and shift work. I'm I'm now adding a couple. Well, I'm going to add one other one that can get in our way: stubbornness. Thinking we know it all. Not being open to new ideas, living in denial. That's a real challenge. So a big part of what I've been focusing on for the last several years is I'm pretty confident about the science and the medicine. I'm always learning new things, but I've seen how things work. I kind of I can recognize those patterns. What I've really been working on is sales, influence, trying to persuade people. How do you get people to move from thinking about something to acting on it? Because thinking about it all day doesn't accomplish anything. Using, being more comfortable with the idea of using fear and anxiety, which is justified, and then offering a solution that motivates, using visual over verbal, using stories over studies. As clinicians, when we go into grand rounds, the doctor, if you had started telling a bunch of stories, the doctors would throw me out. You're unprofessional. You're a hack. That's all anecdotal. But if I'm trying to convince patients and I throw, well, this, the Jupiter trial or the Ascot trial or this trial showed this, they all eyes just glaze over and it doesn't lead to anything. The power of telling stories, I've had to the successful outcomes come from being able to motivate people, and make them more aware. So, and that's still a work in progress. I've actually, one of the Scott Adams. I don't know if you're familiar with
Yeah.
Scott,
Dilbert, right?
Gilbert. I really appreciated Dilbert when I was working at the hospital. Just the whole, the institutional, but yeah, his book Win Bigly, and then another. If you want to understand about marketing, I really enjoy watching YouTube interviews with Rory Sutherland. I don't know if you've ever. He's a British guy, and it's all about how you look at things, and what really matters to people. Why do people make decisions? And we have to realize that it's really emotions that drive our decision making way more than balancing risk versus benefits.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, it's really hard to act on something unless it's staring you right in the face, right? Like, I mean, I remember, I mean, there's so many examples of, it's like I would always learn something, especially when I was a younger guy, be like, oh my God, everyone needs to hear this. And I'd start like talking about it and everyone's like, yeah, whatever. But then it would be, especially with food, like I'll talk about, health and food all day long. Most people don't really take note of anything like that until they're faced with a challenge or a loved one is faced with a challenge. And then they're like, hey, Brent, what was that you're talking about back here? Or, what you're talking about, but, like whatever it might have been that I was talking about at the time. But
Mhm.
yeah, it's just like, that's the hardest thing about human psychology. You can't force anyone to do anything. They have to be moved to go there themselves. And, the thing that I've figured out just kind of personally is just like, let people know what you do, and then just when they're ready, they'll come and find you when it talks about that. So, but yeah, I mean that's just a challenge, and especially with things that the longevity switch of like, or just the health span. You've heard that obviously, but it's just like if we're going good. Usually it's like, okay, great. It's just going to keep on being like this way. Like people just don't think about the consequences of that. Or it's like, it's almost like getting your car fixed or whatever. It's like getting, the oil change. It's these things that you don't really see, but like, I guess, because it's a pretty well-known consequence if you don't change your oil, if you don't change your tires or, whatever these things are. And with health, it's even like just a little bit even more different because it's if it's not broke, don't fix it. But I feel like that is changing a little bit, especially with like longevity medicine, functional medicine, a lot of this stuff, the preventative care, the health span. Really, people are like really trying to optimize that. And like you said, like even like CrossFit, I think had a lot to do with kind of sparking that. Is just like, hey, going to the gym is fine, but I think we can get better results by doing like kind of these hit workouts and like these I forget all the CrossFit talk, the AMRAMs and, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But, just like really get into it and like digging into like, hey, what is the best form of these things? And I feel like CrossFit, one of the things that they really brought was that high intensity workout type stuff, these HIIT workouts that, obviously they weren't the ones that probably invented it, but I feel like they're the ones that kind of brought this new school of kind of fitness to things. And I think that's also integrated with, longevity medicine. People are interested in feeling better, living longer lives, healthier lives, not necessarily longer lives, although I think there's a lot of people that do, including myself, that would like to live a longer life, but also just like the health span part of it. As long as you're here on this earth, let's make the most of those 80 years you're here, or 90 years, or 100 years, and really be healthy to the end, instead of that, the sick care system is like, I don't think anyone really wants to live to 100 if their last 20 years of just life is just miserable. I mean, I don't think anyone really wants that. So,
I
so
call it squaring the curve because, for most of Americans are now, you go along and then you have a heart issue, and then you have a heart attack, and then you have a stroke, and then you're demented. Let's die old and healthy,
yeah,
at whatever age that is, and be as functional and contributing as opposed to becoming dependent. And one of the things that I'm pivoting more toward now is, okay, if you don't give a damn about your health, think about your wife or your husband. Who's going to have to take care of you. And what if I know you don't care about if you die, but what if you have a stroke and you're paralyzed and you can't talk and you don't die? Uh, One of the things that, going back to Scott Adams, reframing the conversation, away from, and let's face it, I mean, human beings are selfish by nature. We tend to think primarily of ourselves. Part of this is, realizing that what we do from a health point of view has impact, has repercussions, for our family, for our community, for our business, for, the people that depend upon us. So we have not only an opportunity, but also in a sense, a bit of an obligation, to be as healthy as we can. I think one of the things that I think the conversation around health is getting better because it's being taken away from the people who are focused on sickness, you know, and public health and, profiting from it and finding ways to, monetize it to, how can we make health a virtue, how should I say, not something that we, not a vanity, but, just something that it should be expected to be a full human being. One of the things about the CrossFit approach that I appreciated was not only the high intensity, but it was the multidisciplinary. It's not just about exercise. They talked about diet and nutrition, the paleo diet, and then functional movement, flexibility, balance, virtuosity, all those different things that were kind of pounded into me from day one. And they were before Greg Glassman got run out on a rail, for reasons that, kind of notorious, but, he was referring to what was going on in healthcare as the mess. And I can't think of a better term for it. But one of the things I think you mentioned is that, you know, is the system going to fix itself? And I think the answer is emphatically, I'll just say flat out, I'm certain of this. The answer is no. So that's why I'm not trying to fix the current system. I'm trying to be part of building a new approach that makes the old system irrelevant, obsolete, you know, seem ridiculous in retrospect, all these kinds of things, and to build more resilience into myself and to the people that I provide care for and educate them, motivate them. That's why I use the word coaching. I think coaching describes better what I do now than being a medical doctor. I'm just here to point out your opportunities for improvement, give you the tools to see that improvement, and then hold you accountable for those outcomes with measurements. That's one of the things that one of the things I need to emphasize more than more of, and I'm trying to focus on this. If any of your w- listeners or viewers are, clinicians, I love what I'm doing now as a physician. Now, how many doctors do you talk to can say, I love what I'm doing? Because it's become very demoralized as a profession. Um, because why? Because I have a good balance of life of my, I can most being proactive in the care means we can schedule everything. We don't have to react to a, event in the middle of the night. These are, think about, it's, I talked with a fireman, fire captain recently. It's like, most of the fires that people you save from fires are from building code inspections, not getting up in the middle of the night and go and fight a fire because you made the building less prone to catch on fire, handling the flammable materials, the decisions that are made long before. So it's it's not only great for patients, it's great for professionals, from that point of view.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I
and
feel
working
like,
with the dental community has been it's it's had its challenges, but it's also opened my eyes to a lot of other things, to respect the way that they're looking at things too. But at least some of them, the ones that are more progressive, like, the one that you encountered.
yeah, like Dr. Chrisman here in Tucson. Yeah. I mean, it's always a challenge. I mean, I've known so much about, the medical industry for sure, as well as the dental industry, that like, I feel like they're just still stuck in the stone ages with, with some of the stuff they're doing. And it's really tough to find a good dentist that is kind of like a biological, progressive thinking dentist that's not just going to do the normal whatever procedures. And that was one of the great things about Dr. Chrisman, who I went to, that, the intake, it was just like going into a longevity doctor for a first time, or a really good functional medicine doctor. It's not a 15-minute thing. It's a 2 or 3 hour process that they're, and like when I sat down, they're giving me the cardioid scans and just bacteria tests in my mouth, and like heavy metals testing, and just a whole litany of tests, which was awesome. Like that was just, as soon as I was there for that, I was like, okay, this is the right place to be. I know I found the right dentist for me and my family, because I know that they took the time, and it costs a little bit more money, sure, but I know the end result is going to pay for itself in spades by doing a little bit of that, ounce of prevention prevents a pound of, whatever that saying is there. But it's true. And then just also touching back on the doctors, like you're loving what you're doing now. And one of the things that the privilege I get to deal with like my longevity clinic marketing business, where I deal with longevity clinics and doctors, most of them have left that system to start these longevity clinics. And I have to say that most of them are very happy in this thing, because they're actually moving the needle. They're really helping people, and they've left that whole system behind, as most of them, I guess fortunately or unfortunately, they don't deal with insurances. They don't have to deal with all the, the red tape and PCMs and, or
Yeah.
PC, like, the pharmaceutical insurance, and, like that whole mess, as Glassman would say. And so it's really, it's really cool to be working with individuals like that and clinics like that, really do love what they're doing, and they love what because they're seeing results just like you are with who they're working with. And so that's just a really cool thing.
The one thing I would appeal to the longevity market providers is, if I can tell one more story, and I don't know how we're doing for time. Um, I recently had uh, a gentleman. He's in his early 40s. He had a shoulder injury. He was a athlete in high school and college. He's the CEO of an international company. Lives about 3 hours north of where I am here in Springfield, Illinois, in the Chicago area. And he went to a longevity clinic in Las Vegas, I think. Um, got peptide and I think stem cell therapy for
Stem
his
cells, yeah.
shoulder injury, and and got on a anti-aging longevity program, and but also happened to have a carotid ultrasound, because the company that interprets my studies had a booth there. And he found out that his arterial age was considerably older, and he had unexpected plaque and inflammatory changes. So he left there with treatment for his shoulder injury, and he was very happy with the fact that he was now, instead of running a 10-minute mile, he was running a 7.5-minute mile, and his weight had dropped by 20 pounds, and he was, you know, throwing the ball, 75 miles an hour now in his 40s. He had been a pitcher in high school and college, and he was really excited about that, but he was wondering if anything had happened with his artery, artery change. So he did his research. He found a dentist similar to Dr. Chrisman in Oak Park, Illinois, and got that I had trained in a similar way to do the ultrasounds. And lo and behold, his arterial age had not gotten any better in, I think, over 6 months. And so he came to see me. We identified a number of issues related to his cardiometabolic health that had not been addressed or even looked at, particularly by the longevity clinic. And my comment to him is, and we're going to get a follow-up in a few weeks here. I'll be anxious to see if I've done him any good. I predicted, I believe that, will have done some good. But I said, had you gone on, you would have been a very good, athletic looking, very fit corpse. So it's important to do the body work and the paint job, but, if the engine's about to blow up, none of that's really going to matter in winning the race. And so I think and I'm not, throwing any shade on, I think everybody's doing the best they can with describing their part of the elephant. The story, the blind men describing the elephant, depending on where they were, it's either like a tree or it's like a rope or it's like but the point is we all need to recognize that we have our blind spots and none of us have all of the answers. But I think that making this case that, if you have good arterial health and or what people commonly call cardiovascular health, that's kind of essential. That's kind of basic to everything else. And, but if you don't, you don't have, what is that? I can't remember who said that if a healthy man has many, many dreams and goals and aspiration, an unhealthy man has only one, not being sick or getting over their illness. So, anyway, I think the interdisciplinary, the need for us to be talking to one another and recognizing, okay, I've got this angle covered, but you might want to look at this. So I don't do, somebody asked me about peptides or aging management. I said, well, here's resources for that. I'll take care. I'll play my position and play it as well as I can, recognizing that I'm too short to be a center, but the centers are too clumsy to be to be a point guard. Although watching the NCAA in the Final Four, or it's like, my God, some of the athleticism of some of these big men is just unbelievable.
Yeah, well, it's the NCAA right now is huge here in Tucson because I think Wildcats are rated number 1 or number 2 right now. So it's it's been pretty crazy here in town to see everyone, with all that but yeah, with the athleticism there. I mean, one thing you talked about with your friend there, he went to this clinic in Vegas and got tuned up and was able to improve his athleticism, start running faster miles and whatever. But I think that's one of the biggest misnomers. And I'd like you to kind of address this too, is just because you got the 6-pack, like you said, the paint job and the tires or whatever. I think that's such a common misconception, including myself up until, fairly recently, in the last couple of years. Oh, I'm fine. I'm a bike rider, I can, crush, I'm still crushing, personal bests on my bike and I'm getting better and I'm faster and I'm eating and sleeping and my Whoop tells me about my sleep score and HRV and all this is great. So I must be doing fine. There's no chance of heart disease with me, but that's obviously not true. Right?
Well, exactly. There's a lot, I call them blind spots, in this. I think, the program that I learned and that I've fine-tuned to fit my practice style and emphasis covers most of those blind spots, but there's genetic factors that you may not be aware of. If you're otherwise physically fit, but you have a mouthful of high risk bacteria that you didn't know about that that are causing problems, and nobody looked, that could be causing all this silent problem, and then suddenly you have an event. It's it's good to look under the hood and make sure that everything else is okay. And here's, I think, the key thing, and I finally figured out how to explain this because I've run into like this guy I talked to is that, and you're an exception, or well, you're different in this respect. You recognize that most people say, if I tell them, well, your arterial age is 20 years older than your chronological age, and it can be better, immediately they shut down. How can that be? It can't be. They're offended. It's like, how dare you? It's almost like, how dare you tell me I'm going to die from a heart attack when I feel so, I look so great. And so I finally come up with, you know, you can do all these things, but sometimes you just don't get the arterial health you deserve. You're doing a lot of good things, but there's these two or three things have been missing in the evaluation, but we can help you with that. So, get past the ego and get to work on those things, and you can have have all these things, but we have to be open-minded that, hey, maybe we don't have all the answers, or maybe I have to be circumspect about the last 5 podcasts I've read or listened to, which give me different flavors of advice. How do I deal with all the noise? Well, I mean, part of the answer is establishing a relationship with somebody that you can trust, who has a track record, who's credible, who, knows how to communicate and figure out your priorities and put it all together. So, I mean, I look at things like in, you know, these programs like Function Health, where you can get 100 tests, for in a very reasonable price. My question is, if you can get 100 of those 100 tests for less than $500, why did, when your insurance was paying for it, it would cost $5,000. That's a whole nother conversation. But I say, it's a lot like, calling up Home Depot or Lowe's and saying, I want a house, and they drop a load of lumber on a lot. Here's your house. Well, some assembly required. Somebody's got to have the experience to say, okay, that's really important in your case, and it might be important in 98% of other cases, but in your case, this is more important that we need to be focusing on. And I spend a lot of my day um, doing that. And I really, I it's both challenging, and but also, it can be frustrating at times. And narratives develop about certain things. Can I put in a bit of, can I put in maybe for your audience, maybe a counter narrative to the statin and the pharma narrative? Because I get a lot of people who are very skeptical about, the benefits versus the side effects of statins. And I would just say that statins are primarily useful because they're anti-inflammatory. They're safer and better tolerated at lower doses, yet still get the same reduction in events for heart attack and stroke. Now, there are alternatives that are in the nutraceutical space that sometimes get similar results, but um, I'm always I have many conversations with people who, when I show them what the true outcomes with low dose, like I'm talking about 20% of the usual starting dose statins, and they see the reduction in arterial age over time, and then in themselves, it's hard to not be uh, for me not to at least offer that to people and give them that opportunity.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit. What I'd like to hear, and probably my audience does too, is like, how are you helping people, like when they come to you or through a channel, through the dentist, or they might be coming through you for finding you online, or maybe through this podcast? Can you describe what the process is that how you work with people that come to you? And it sounds like, I guess I would ask, like, who's the perfect client for you? But it sounds like probably most people are, because it's just something that's hidden, and it's not like, hey, I'm trying to improve my PR push-up max or something. It's something that, it sounds like most people would benefit from finding this information out.
Well, I may not improve the number of push-ups you can do it, but I can improve the chances you'll still be doing them 10 years from now or 20 years from now. Um, the so generally, and I've evolved over the years. I was taught, the first thing to do is get a crud. intimate media thickness ultrasound as kind of the gateway. But first of all, if somebody's already had an event, it's not too late to prevent the next event. I have patients in their 90s, who couldn't care less if they dropped dead from a heart attack, but they don't want to have progressive memory loss from dementia, which can be slowed or prevented by the same basic principles. The root causes for cardiovascular disease, neuropathy, dementia, kidney failure are all, there's a common pathway called chronic inflammation, oxidative stress brought on by, the bad S's I mentioned, but they can be mitigated by, interventions. So if they've had an event, call me. I do what I call Discover Zoom. So what are your, where are you? What can we do? And that can be, it's no cost. We just talk about, what's the interest. But if there are no symptoms, but want to be proactive for whatever reason, because of family history or just, something happened to a friend, a loss or you just whatever, uh, typically starts out with some kind of screening measurement or baseline measurement. So carotid ultrasound, if we see plaque here, then we know we have something to work on and motivate and follow for measurement. If the carotids are clean, coronary artery calcium score is useful as a screening tool, but it's not useful as something to monitor or measure for monitoring for benefit. And I won't go into all the details for that right now, but just to plant the seed that that's not an ideal screening tool. But or if they know that they have an elevated lipoprotein A because of a function health test or let's just, tell me what you got. Let's see where we can go from there. Um, if they're close enough or, that they can come see me, that's great. But I'm developing this. My goal is to develop a network I call them scanners. I don't like the word provider. Provider is a contractual term that's been used to describe professionals. I'm a medical professional. You know, I don't provide. I care for people and I treat and I coach. But so the point is, I call like Dr. Chrisman is one of my dental scanners. Dr. Scapulato in Oak Park is a dental scanner. I support him in helping him interpret the images that he obtains, that Dr. Chrisman obtains, and then following up with the patients with their problem, as I did in your case, and many others. So now we see we have a problem with good baseline measurement. You know, one of the other tools I use is a body composition analyzer, which there are many brands. I happen to have an InBody 570. I have another one that's in about an hour away from here. It's networked into the same database, so I can follow people on the InBody. And then we use Quest Diagnostic for the laboratory testing. So let's say you have this condition, we need to get to the root causes. There's about a dozen tests, um, about 4 of which are standard in a general panel, but the other 8 are above and beyond. We get that drawn at a Quest Patient Service Center, which they're all over the country, and they have a common data or common platform for entering the orders and retrieving the orders. And then we meet, when those test results are back, and we start doing our assembly. We have our IKEA dresser parts laying on the floor. We're trying to them. I'll help you put it all together into a plan. And then I use I call that the first huddle. So then we develop a game plan, and in about 3 months, we re-huddle and look at the results of the blood tests. And then typically, if things that are working, we keep doing, and things that aren't optimized, we fine tune. And that's iterated every 3 to 6 months in general, depending. If they get time off for good results, if the results aren't what we want, we might have to re-huddle up a little bit quicker. So it's all a matter of just monitoring over time. And so, people, I think monitoring is important for accountability, particularly with lifestyle related diseases. We need to be reporting in and, be remotivated, from time to time. That's why personal trainers are so effective. Um, because as I mentioned, human nature, uh, I don't work myself out of a job. I mean, very few people get it, spend 6 months with it and go on for the next, 6 years, never be seen again and continue to get the same results because that fall off the wagon, whatever have you. Um, so it's a great the key the challenge is coming up with a business model that makes sense, that more people can afford it, which in my estimation, people are paying a lot of money, or somebody's paying for their health insurance. If the insurer will cover a service, then let's get it covered. But just because they don't cover it, let's try to find a way that makes it, you know, accessible and affordable. And, you don't have to, one of the other elements I think that I kind of separated a bit from my mentors in that I don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. So if we can nudge you, you know, 20% of where you need to be, that's 20% better. If I can get you 100% there, that's great, but we don't, it's a step by step. No, very few people can consume or modify more than 3 things at one time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
if
that
I
makes
throw a
sense.
dozen things at you, it just, gets lost.
So so you're looking at blood panels that you're getting, and you're ordered specialized ones that are kind of, like you said, go above and beyond. You've got the in-body, which is body composition, similar to like
Right,
a DEXA or something like that, right?
right,
Where you actually see body fat, visceral, subcutaneous, all those things. And then the cardioid ultrasounds. Those are kind of your three tools there. So when you begin looking at all these things, is it more about finding like just one big issue? Is it there? Or is it kind of stacking multiple small things that you're thinking and kind of like playing with the little switches there? Because I imagine this isn't a one size fits all approach, correct?
correct. Absolutely. You've seen one, I call them cure plans. You've seen one cure plan. It's just like contracts. You've seen one contract, you see one contract. Everyone has their own unique circumstances. There are things that people can do. Maybe their diet is off track because, their spouse isn't on board and they're the cook. And one of the things from a marketing point of view, well, actually from a marketing and care point of view, is if I see uh, a woman, ask, well, what about your husband? And vice versa. If I see him, if, and typically if the wife brings the husband in to be evaluated, I then turn to her and often find that she has more of a problem than he does. But the key thing is and I can coach a couple more effectively than the individuals. So, but I've probably got a little bit off track there, but you come up, okay, here is the list of opportunities, what do we want to address first and how can we address this? And, here's the list of supplements that I think would, address each one of these issues, and we'll address them to the extent we can. And then when we reconvene, we see what kind of progress has been made on each one of those elements until we get them all right. I'd liken it a lot more to how the multidisciplinary approach to cancer. It's not just radiation treatment, it's not just surgery, it's not just chemotherapy, and now they develop, there's uh, targeted therapies and all these other, you know, ways. And it's really almost like being a chef in a kitchen, and you have these ingredients, and how do you you know, come up with the right recipe for that, appropriate dish. And I think this is where, but there are enough common themes that we focus on that, everybody can start on. So one of the things I've developed a template in my electronic medical record and a checklist that I go through. Okay, and this is something that would be optimal but optional. We can put it off for right now. Let's see how things go. We don't have to do everything all right away to kind of deal with budgets and lifestyle issues. So that's what makes it, kind of fun, because it's not broke. But I would say that the biggest issues that are typically overlooked is too much attention paid to cholesterol and not enough attention paid to insulin resistance and, sweets and starches and processed foods. Um, Too much emphasis, more emphasis on exercise and not enough on what we put in our mouths, in terms of dieting. Right now, another challenge is, that with the GLP-1 inhibitors, the Ozempic, the Wegovy, and, these weight loss drugs is, yeah, maybe somebody who's 350 pounds, who's, about to go on insulin because their diabetes is out of control. That's a good solution. But if you're 15, 20% overweight, and it's just because, your spouse keeps buying you potato chips and you shouldn't be having those, that we need to deal with it differently. So, um, and just, you know, the idea that there's a magic bullet or a magic pill that's going to solve everything. Um, there's, although I will say that, the war, I call it the war on statins, or the anti-statinism, or as I think, um, misguided at least, and I think it's actually potentially going to lead to worse outcomes. But it gets people to buy into more lucrative PCSK9 inhibitor pharmaceuticals. They buy more supplements. They have more stents and surgery. So maybe there was another motivation going on here.
Yeah. Well, I guess you just never know really with people's personal recommendations there. One thing I wanted to kind of follow back and double click on, with your S's, I kind of lost count because it seems like there's a dozen or so, but you said salt is in there. And I feel like salt is one of those really controversial ones where, you hear like, okay, too much sodium is a bad thing. I think that's established, but then you obviously need sodium like to function, right? And then like with someone like me that's living in Arizona and sweating all the time, it's like, okay, I do see supplements, or maybe not supplements, but products like Element, for instance, that are advertised all over by influencers, and then, you know, full spectrum salts, that are, like I think Baja Gold is one of them, that they always say that, that the sodium content is actually lower and then the mineral content is a little bit higher. So is it actually sodium that we're looking out for? And what exactly is it that we want to watch out for when it comes to overdoing it on this thing? Is it a lower quality sodium that we want to watch out for? And I know it has something to do with arterial stiffness, right? Is the sodium component to what you're talking about?
Well, it's far more complicated than we would have time for to go into detail, but I
Okay,
would
fair
say,
enough.
um, that, um, you know, I keep it in there because it's hard to be, I kind of have my feet in both camps, because I don't, uh, I think we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I would say I'm more liberal. Salt is, if I had to organize it in terms of priorities, I kind of do when I go to the sweets, starches, and snacks are at the top of the list. Cetos are kind of in the middle. Salt is toward the end, and like even smoking. I think sometimes think that maybe smoking, caught the attention when sugar was doing all the crime. They say you don't have to outrun the bear; you just have to have a slower friend. So
Yeah, yeah.
the and I mean, I don't encourage people to smoke. Don't get me wrong, but I think we should be paying way more attention to the processed foods, and I think we are starting to now. But I think for the average person who doesn't have high blood pressure, who doesn't have heart failure, who is physically active, I don't recommend salt restriction at all. You know, I don't say, take salt tablets, that sort of thing. Um, but there are people who have heart failure, who have hard to control hypertension. Although honestly, I think the number one thing that's overlooked, or maybe not the number one, but very commonly overlooked, is sleep disturbances, sleep apnea, which is where the dental community can play a big role. I I call it the five stages of dealing with CPAP. I have patients who have gone through this. You know, there's no way I have sleep apnea. And then, well, if I have it, it can't be that bad, and I can't see myself ever doing anything about it. All right, well, I guess I have to be tested. Well, I guess I have it. I've been trying it. It's not as bad as I thought. And the final stage is, why didn't you make me do this sooner? And why did we overlook it? So it's an evolution. I'll just throw in a plug for our sleep medicine screenings. And so and so I think that's a big one. But anyways, but go back to you. If I had to drop one of the S's, I would probably drop salt as a priority, to be perfectly honest. But it's there because of, you know, people kind of expect it to be, and it does play a role in some cases.
Yeah, and I feel like it's one of those things that is also closely tied to processed foods, right? They're just like so much sodium in those, and it's probably like most things. There's quality of things matter. And of course, a lot of those things, just like the seed oils, they're not going to throw healthy fats in these processed foods. They're going to throw the cheapest seed oil, Nola, I was just talking with a friend the other day about baby formula, right? That, because we just nerded out when our son was born about like baby formula. And in the States, you couldn't find a decent baby formula. It was all like non-fat milk and then replaced with canola oil, sunflower. You're like, what are you doing? You're putting non-fat milk in here just to replace it with seed oils. And we ended up, buying a brand from Holland that, was like full fat milk. And then the only oil that they had in it was coconut oil, which to me was acceptable. And then, like the folate versus the folic. It was just like bonkers how poor quality formula was in the United States versus other places. And again, it's the quality of the ingredients there, and the, I don't know, I guess that was a weird tangent to go off of there, but just basically like with the seed oils and the quality of these ingredients that are in a thing that should be a healthy thing. But again, when things are too processed, it's all meant for shelf life, profit, not health. And I think that's one of the things you really have to be careful about. And I know there's a lot of companies addressing these things, even just like with potato chips, making them with tallow now versus, seed oils, or, which I think is marginally better. It's probably just fried things in general you should probably cut out. But, like at least there's, like a little bit better options, a little bit more conscious choosing of the ingredients there. So
I call them slightly less bad.
yeah. It's on the, yeah. We tell our son, we're just kind of like good for you, neutral, bad for you, and like a lot of things just come in. He's like, well, what about chocolate chips? I'm like, well, let's just say chocolate's good for you, but the sugar's not that great. So, if it's really dark chocolate, let's call it neutral, and kind of like,
Well, and I think the key thing is that, a treat, an occasional treat is one thing. But a steady diet of the same poison, it can be lethal. And but the problem is that we have a food industry that's focused on consumption, meaning purchasing, meaning sales, and they want it to grow. And so, addiction is a great model for keeping a customer. You don't want to kill them, but you want to keep them addicted. And sugar is it's the number one addictive substance in our environment. You can stay away from alcohol, you can stay away from heroin and cocaine and cannabis, or, tobacco, but it's very, very difficult to get away from sugar. And some people, like some people can drink and never become addicted. Some people might even be functional heroin users, not too many, but with sugar, if you're addicted to it, it's very difficult to be abstinent. So I put in a plug for let's have some compassion for that um, group, but at the same time, let's not enable them or say that that it's not a problem. And you're but sometimes you have to settle for an antidote, and just again do the best you can. My goal is I came up with I said nudge and nudge people in the direction, and somebody said, oh, you don't bludgeon people, so now that's my new. I don't bludgeon you, I nudgeon you.
yeah. And it's all about meeting people where they're at, and that's the great thing about like, your position, that you get to spend some time with people, and a lot of the new, kind of, let's call them just new school practitioners, where you're sitting down for a little while. So you get to really know who a person is, and you can meet them where they're at and just slowly help them along. And so be like, hey, you need to get more exercise. Okay, get out of here, type of thing, which, doesn't do too much of good for most people.
Well, if I could real briefly, I think one of the things I would make a plea to anybody who's looking at these practices, and then you might have to spend in fact, you should have to spend some money out of pocket for that advice. If it's worth anything, you need to have skin in the game. Now, I don't think it's, you know, tens of thousands of dollars. That's not necessary. My goal was I have success with blue collar workers, and as well as, people in the C-suite, maybe even more, because they're a little bit more open, more of an open sponge in terms of what they don't know, but they're very coachable. But, so in my practice, I have, uh, the fee for service for the consultations and the labs and the ultrasounds, much of which is covered by third parties. But at typically at about 6 to 8 months, I do engage them with what I call a proactive medicine investment. And so what you spend on good advice is worth every penny, but it's not a purchase or an expenditure. It's an investment if it's good. Now, if you're not getting good advice or if you're not getting good results from the advice, and I think that's really the key with anything that if we don't debate about is this the right advice or that the right advice or is this person more in tune, it may or may not be for the individual. Let's try it and see what the results are. If you get great results, great, let's keep doing it. But if the results aren't there, then maybe we should try a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, I always think about it, and I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but it's something akin to teaching someone to fish and giving them fish, right? And it's
Right.
like
Right.
teaching someone to fish is way more valuable than just giving them a fish. And I feel like a lot of times you go to a doctor and it's like, okay, here's your prescription med or whatever, and it's not really teaching them anything other than just, it's like here's the thing that will solve your problem. Where, like you just said, the valuable thing that you want to be investing in, to paying for, to really investigating is someone teaching you the process so you come away with something valuable. So, I mean, I can imagine ever not needing a doctor, but it's basically, okay, here's your situation. What is a great thing to like coach you along? This is what will really help you. And then you be able to kind of maintain that on your own. And then obviously coming back for, checkups and making sure it's all going the way it is, but just really like giving that
Well,
information there and learning that.
even the best athletes in the world have coaches that they rely on. And so you can, that's really a great model, and that there's always new things we can learn that come along. And then we find out some things that, we thought were valuable may not be so valuable. We have to be open-minded to being able to make those changes. Or, maybe our circumstances change. Maybe we could afford all those things, and now we can't. Or maybe we couldn't afford them, now we can. It's an ever-moving, fluid, dynamic, situation. But the key thing I was trying to model with people is the further you are from the event on that continuum. If you go to my website, you can see the pictures of the artery, the greater your margin for safety. So if something comes along and pushes you in that direction, an infection, an injury, a surgery, a stressful divorce or whatever, you're moving toward that event, but you start out here, not next to the event. So we make you harder to kill, going back to the old CrossFit, days.
So, Dr. Bax, let's make this real for people who are listening right now. What are a couple things that people can do this week that actually matter? That, I mean, obviously you're unable to diagnose them or whatever, but what are just a couple things that people can do that actually will move the needle for, say, most people?
Well, I'll just reinforce again, the bad S's, minimize your intake of sweet starches, snacks, and sitting, meaning getting up and move more. What kind of exercise? How much exercise should I do? More. What more resistance training? Cardio is good, but resistance training has been overlooked. I think that's starting to become recognized, that lifting things, moving things, resistance bands, those kinds of things. So sweet starches, snacks, seed oils, sitting, don't smoke, of course. Stress, we have to find ways to cope with it and manage it. But be open, I think more than anything, be open-minded, and also be aware that just because somebody has, how should I say, not everything that sounds good is good. And you can spend a lot of money on a lot of things that, you know, now I'm probably going to get in trouble with some of the viewers, what I call entertainment medicine, or, curiosity medicine, or even vanity medicine. It's really important to try to discern, what makes sense from your point of view. What can you implement and do it for the long term? So rather than spending $1,000 or on a red light therapy mask, or $5,000 on a sauna, maybe a good pair of walking shoes, and find a hill to climb would be a better use of that time and money.
Nice. That's some good advice. So if someone wants to learn more about what you do at the Cure Center and talk to you, where should they go? Where would you point them to go first?
If you go to thecurecenter.life, Life, that's my website. The front page, the main page, has a series of buttons. You can download my free book, or you can order it on Amazon as paperback or Kindle. The free version is both is a PDF, and there's also a Speechify version that people can listen to if they prefer that. They can schedule a Discover Zoom just to do that themselves online. We'll just chat like we are now. What are their circumstances and how they can help. And so I think if they go to that page, they'll find pretty much everything. There's explore the website. They'll find my FAQs section, but the book, which uses the acronym CURE, is simply a compilation of the FAQs, the frequently asked questions on my website, or I cover the things so the way I've decided to scale my practice and influence is if I got a question more than a couple of times, I said, well, I need to write up a page or a page and a half that discusses that, explains that, so that I can say a couple of short things and then send them a link to read it. But the book is, I wrote the book as an instruction manual or as an owner's manual. If you're looking for an encyclopedia or a textbook, I think what it is, short, to the point, try to be concise and just, so I don't know if you're old enough to remember Dragnet, Sergeant Joe Friday, just the facts, man.
Yeah. I've never seen the show, but I've definitely heard that term before. So, well, great. So it sounds like thecurecenter.life is where people should go. They can get your book as a free download, right? Or they could go to Amazon to, what was the name of the book?
RE, the catastrophic, unseen, reversible epidemic of progressive cardiometabolic disease is a subtitle. It's kind of long, but just if you go to Amazon and you search for CURE, it'll pop up. It's I don't have a copy of it here, but it's the same color as my shirt. I kind of picked this color as my company colors, if you will.
You got the theme going. That's awesome. Well,
be consistent.
Dr. Bax, thanks for joining me today and educating and just sharing your knowledge and wisdom. It's been a treat to get to talk to you here. And to those listening, if you got value from this, share it with someone who's trying to figure out their health. It's like, I feel like that's a lot of people, and a lot of people are getting more and more clued into this. So share the podcast. It helps me out. It helps Dr. Bax out, and it will help you and who you share it with out too. So, and then also, if you're a clinic owner or practitioner doing real work like this and want to get help getting more patients, that's what we do at the longevityclinicmarketing.com. And also Spanner, like I mentioned at the beginning, SPANNR.com. That is where all things longevity, great directory if you're trying to find a great doctor in your area that specifically helps you with living a longer, healthier life. Go there, check it out. So appreciate y'all. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you very much.
This is the Longevity Loop Podcast.